Welcome to the Story of the Bible, Part 2. Today we will study Genesis chapters 12 through 50, and I want you to see how in Genesis chapter 12 the story of the Bible really begins to develop. Now remember, we're seeing how the entire Bible story can be summarized in three prophecies. The first prophecy is that someone called the Messiah would come into the world to suffer and die for sins. Second prophecy is that the good news would go to all the people of the earth. The third prophecy is that the Messiah would return and be a king over all the earth. So let's get started. Part 2 of the story of the Bible is called A Chosen Man, and that chosen man is Abraham. 4,000 years ago, God reached into our world and he selected a man called Abraham. And this is where the story of the Bible begins to really develop. Do you remember Genesis chapters 11 and 12? We saw how people were migrating across the face of the whole earth. And what the Lord did was he reached into a small town called Ur, which is in the country of Iraq today. In fact, Ur is the city of Nasiriyah in Iraq today. And he chose this one man, Abraham. And he made promises to this man, Abraham. Now, these promises are very important, and we're going to see these promises, and we have to remember these promises because the promises he makes to Abraham are how the Bible story will be opening up and fulfilled. Now, this city of Ur in Iraq is not so far away from another country called Israel, but in Abraham's day, there was no Israel. You see, God asked Abraham to leave his country, to leave his people, and to go to the land that God would show him. And that land was Israel. And so he made the journey over to this land, which we now call Israel, and God gave Abraham that land. God in the Bible is a promise maker, and he's a promise keeper. And this is really important. We're going to see these promises that God made to Abraham. And think about it. He made those promises 4,000 years ago. He hasn't forgotten them today. He's still working on fulfilling those promises that he made. And think about this. From the beginning of the Bible, from the beginning of its story, we see something beautiful about our God. That is, God in the Bible is not asking what you can do for him. He's telling you what he will do for you. He's asking you, do you believe him? Let's see what those promises were that God made to Abraham. First of all, they have to do with land. As I mentioned earlier, Abraham left his homeland, his home people, and went to the land where God showed him that he was going to give him. That land is called Israel. God also promised he would make Abraham into a nation, and that nation we call Israel. God also promised that he would bless Abraham, and God has blessed Abraham. In the story of Genesis, you will see how amazingly blessed Abraham was. But that blessing wasn't just for him. The Bible tells us that he would also be the person through whom the family of the Messiah would come. The Messiah is going to come through Abraham and through his family. But finally, that blessing, it's not just for Abraham. It's for all the people on the earth. Now, I want to show you one of the Bible verses that we see this promise being made. In fact, this is the first time we see the promise made to Abraham. God spoke these words to him. It's in Genesis chapters 12, verses 1 to 3. Let's read this together. The Lord said to Abraham, "Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land I will show you." There we see the first part of the promise, the land. I will make you into a great nation. There's the nation. And I will bless you. There's the blessing. I will make you famous. Think about it. 4,000 years after God spoke to this man, 4,000 years after Abraham lived, you and I are studying his life. I'd say he's pretty famous. And you will be a blessing to others, and I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. and all the families on earth will be blessed through you. Abraham had a son. His name was Isaac, and he had a grandson named Jacob. These three men we call the patriarchs. Whenever you read the Bible and you hear of the fathers or the patriarchs, it's referring to these three. God himself spoke the promise to Abraham, but also to Isaac and also to Jacob. Now, this is important because it means that Abraham did not simply pass on the promise to Isaac, and Isaac passed it on to Jacob. It means that God himself chose the family line for the Messiah. It means that God, speaking the promise to Abraham and then speaking it to Isaac and then speaking it to Jacob, is showing us who the family line of the Messiah actually is. In fact, God spoke this promise 10 times to these men. The first 8 times, he spoke it to Abraham. And I'm going to show you these 8 promises. We're going to walk through them real quickly. The first time we read about in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, that's when Abraham first left his hometown and his people to go to the land that God would show him. The second time is in Genesis chapter 13, verses 14 to 18. And there it's the story where Lot separated from Abraham and took the Jordan plain. The Lord spoke to Abraham and said, "It doesn't matter what Lot has chosen, I have given you all this land." And the promise in its full form is repeated again. The third time is Genesis chapter 15. God promised Abraham that he would make his descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and then he made a vow that he would keep with Abraham. The fourth time is Genesis chapter 17, and that's a sign of circumcision that the Jewish males had to perform, and this was a way that God would show that he was going to keep the promise. In this chapter 17, God says he will give the people this land forever. The fifth time is in Genesis chapter 18, when the Lord reveals that he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and he again repeats this promise to Abraham. The sixth time is when Hagar and Ishmael are sent away, and Isaac is then recognized as the son, and the promise is again repeated in its fullness. Genesis chapter 22 is the seventh time, and that's the story of where Abraham offers his son Isaac to God, and God provides a lamb. Very famous story. God again repeats the promise at this time. Now, the eighth time is when Eliezer goes to Ur to get Isaac a wife, and there the promise is repeated again. The ninth time the promise is repeated is to Isaac this time, and this is when Isaac lived near Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. The 10th time is spoken to Jacob, and this is when Jacob left to go back to Haran when he was running away from his brother Esau. And there, at the Stairway to Heaven story, Bethel, it's not about climbing that stairway to get to heaven. It's about God descending that stairway and in the place of Bethel, promising that he would bless and pass on this blessing of his father and grandfather to him, Jacob. The promises made to these forefathers are so important that we see other Bible writers always talking about these. They know that the story of the Bible rests on these promises being fulfilled. I want to show you 3 examples of this. The first example is written 400 years after these promises were made, and watch how the Bible writer is aware that the promise needs to be fulfilled. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of their slavery, their cry for help rose to God. God heard their groaning and remembered his promise with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I want to show you another example. This one is written 1,000 years after the promises were made to the patriarchs. Notice how the writer knows of the promises and is aware that the promises are being fulfilled by God. He is mindful of his covenant forever, of the word that he commanded for 1,000 generations, the covenant he made with Abraham, his sworn promise to Isaac. which he confirmed to Jacob as a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as a portion for your inheritance. Amazing. I want you to see one other example. This one is written 2,000 years after the promises were made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by the Apostle Paul, and he writes these words. The Scriptures looked forward to this time when God would declare the Gentiles, that's the non-Jewish people, to be righteous because of their faith. God proclaimed this good news to Abraham long ago when he said, all nations will be blessed through you. We just read that, Genesis 12:3. And there, the Apostle Paul, 2,000 years later, knows that God is fulfilling the promises to the patriarchs. Notice it next time you read how many times the forefathers are mentioned and the promises made to them. It's important. Don't forget it. So we see all these wonderful promises that God made Abraham, but there's one promise we haven't seen yet, and that's the promise of faith. The promise of faith says that God sees you and he sees me as perfect people because we believe that he can do what he promised he would do. That's an old promise. It's not a new one. All through the Bible, anyone that God accepts as a perfect person and sees as a perfect person is a person who believes that he can do what he said he would do. Genesis chapter 15, verse 6 is where we learn this. Abram, at this point in the story of Genesis, did not have a child. If he didn't have a child, how could God bring a nation through him? How could he bring the Messiah through him? And so God promised him, don't worry, I'm going to give you a son. I'm going to make your children as more numerous than the stars in the heaven. And the Bible says that Abraham believed God, and God saw him as a perfect person. Did you know that Abraham died without seeing these promises fulfilled? He didn't see you. He didn't see me. He didn't see the suffering Messiah. Many things he didn't see. He had to die believing that God was going to do in the future what he promised he would do. That's the promise of faith. You believe, you receive life, you believe, God sees you as perfect. The wonderful promise that comes from Abraham. Let's conclude part 2 of the story of the Bible by focusing on the family line of the Messiah. Abram had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, and one of them, his name was Judah. Judah is the man through whom the Messiah would come. It says this in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from his descendants, until the coming of the one to whom it belongs, the one whom all nations will honor. So as we conclude this story of the Bible, we see the promises God made to these patriarchs. They will be fulfilled throughout the rest of the Bible. And we have our eye on this family line of the Messiah. So watch part 3, and let's see how this story continues to develop. Be blessed.